Avatar, Fire and Ash, Planetary Mother, Civilizational Threshold, and the End of Innocence. We live in a strange moment. Everything feels like it's accelerating. Technology, politics, culture. Yet somehow we feel stuck, anxious, polarized, and exhausted. We have more information than ever and less clarity about what it all means. And nothing seems to make sense anymore. There are moments in history when the old maps stop working. The indicators lag, the institutions strain, the stories fracture. Yet something new is already moving beneath the surface, in the ruptures and intersections of a fragmented and fragmenting world, inside the interstices of its subliminal and superliminal crevices. This is nothing other than our new sublime luminary light emerging from the cracks in everything. The luminosity beneath, within, and from behind the darkness. Yet again creating a new world by re-entering and reproducing it anew from beyond the invisible. As in the beginning, as always, so it is now. From death to life, from nothing to something. Creation is a kind of resurrection. A resurgence, one might call it. When the vital force of life breaks into the inanimate, that world of mere matter becomes animated. Spirit, breath, energy, and the flowering of life from somewhere beyond the physical. If you've ever felt that something profound is trying to emerge beneath the chaos, you're in the right place and at the right time. This is about those moments, about that moment, about this moment in time. It won't be perfect, but it will be perfectly imperfect. This voice offering is an attempt to slow down just enough to see those patterns beneath all the noise. Are there signals of life present in the chaos? Is there a pulse? Is life greening forth ever anew yet again? Perhaps it will become a podcast. Perhaps this will evolve into that. That is certainly the aim. Here and now, however, if this works the way it's supposed to, maybe even if it's all a bit messy in the beginning, maybe even a lot messy, like all early life is. If it's all that, I would love to explore with you stories, film, ancient text, technology, and current events. Not as separate topics, but as parts of one unfolding human experiment. Every civilization tells stories about itself. That's what human life does. Birds sing, animals have their behaviors, we tell stories, we make myth. And cinema spells out our own mythological and narrative origins of the kind of life we live, the type of vitality that we are, and how it functions within our life context, within our lived experience. Cinema tells our stories, develops our myths in our time. In ancient time, those stories were written in stars by prophets and in tales of how heaven and earth met and interfaced through the gods and legends of great men and women, and of how eternity and time intertwined through them. Today, these things are written in code, film, markets, and by intelligent machines. This offering is about reading these and and those stories together through the lens of a kind of epistemic choreography, if you will, kind of choreography we're about to perform here. A voice choreography, perhaps. We'll move between prophets and data centers, between Avatar and AI, between ancient apocalyptic imagination and modern constitutional crises, between music and politics, art and constitutional law, stories, film, ancient text, technology, and current events. All fair game here. Not to collapse them into each other, but to understand the deeper synchronization, pattern, and rhythm that connects them all. The pattern that connects. And this is just the first installment, the initial instantiation of those initial conditions. It won't be perfect. And then we will reiterate, repeat anew that which came before, refine that which is now ancient, but will again become originary in new in some imaginable future, some sort of future primitive, perhaps. As Shakespeare once wrote, "And as the sun is daily new and old, so is my love still telling what is told." In verse, of course, he said that, something to that effect, if I remember correctly, but Shakespeare was often prophetic, even if never intentionally. The book of Revelation 2 is prophetic, and it declares that the Spirit of Jesus is the spirit of prophecy. Perhaps cinema too is prophecy, or I'd like to think that it can be. At least in a sense that it can prepare us for what is about to emerge in our own experience and culture. But more than that, this will be an exploration of how to remain coherent when heaven and earth meet and interface, and energy as power is released. And no one else knows what to do because no one understands what is truly going on or how to interpret it or go about it. That's when we need myth most. That's the threshold where novel myths are formed. That's where new life begins. And that too is cinema at its best, or it can be. It can mend such ruptures like all great art can do if it functions like it's supposed to. And so too with pieces like this. Perhaps this is philosophy too, among other things. And philosophy at its best when it is that which its name purports it to be, the love of wisdom. When it functions at all, it always comes just in time to rescue us before we fall into the abyss of nihilism, of misunderstanding, of nothing really matters, nothing is all we need, as the song goes. And from that, there can be no return. Some say that good theology can do this. But without true myth that functions beyond the religious and makes us move, whether we like it or not, through its numinosity, its irresistible push and pull, there cannot be true religion or any meaningful secularism at all. But that's for another time. See, there's always an underlying mythology to a civilization or culture or an identity. It cannot be any other way. It's either that or it's nothing. It's nihilism. Logos is often a threshold phenomenon that weaves together just such a thing, such a myth, and just in the nick of time, precisely when this is most needful, when all things seem lost, when everything is about to fall apart. It's what J.R.R. Tolkien might have called a eucatastrophe, a good catastrophe, a disaster in which storytelling emerges that retells our narrative in a way that captures the new meaning and reorganizes our perception, our senses, our sense of reality, so that we might once again make sense of it, of what is, and find our way through it without getting lost, so that we may once again as ever know who we are, how to be, and how to act within the new reality. This novel narrative and context, this new dwelling place, or incipient house of being, as Martin Heidegger might have put it. Here we can make our own or new dwelling place. A new platform upon which we can again refine our purpose, find our peace and orientation, even if not a sense of safety and comfort. Like I said, this will not be perfect. It cannot be. But it'll be perfectly imperfect, so let's get to it. There is no turning back now from this wild logos at the movies. And remember, because remembering is so much more psychotic than forgetting, or so I heard in a movie once. The source code is being written while the world sleeps. And while the world sleeps, we're awake, aren't we? And sufficiently advanced mathematics is indistinguishable from prophecy. Since all of this, at least in part, is written with the help of AI, these large language models, which are nothing if not advanced mathematics, it just might turn out to be prophetic as well. Perhaps. Maybe, if we wish hard enough. Maybe. And if you don't want spoilers of some scenes, you will stop right here and go watch the movie and come back and listen to this review and feel a bit more enlightened about it all in the aftermath. Avatar: Fire and Ash, the infrastructural event. James Cameron's Avatar: Fire and Ash arrives not as cinema, but as planetary ritual. A 3-hour technological ceremony that crossed 760 million globally in its first 10 days. I saw it on the first day. So it secured for Disney first $6 billion post-pandemic year. Disney made $6 billion this year. But this movie polarized critics. It's 67 on Rotten Tomatoes is what my statistics say. And audiences searched this movie into the low 90s. Those are the scores. Yes, current, as I'm checking right now, on the 28th and 29th of December, the verified audience score in places like Rotten Tomatoes and Fresh Popcorn Meter are at 91 and 92%. This reflects strong word of mouth and contrasts the critic divide. This split is not noise. It is the film's actual subject matter playing out in reception. A civilization arguing with itself about whether myths can still teach, whether spectacle can still mean, whether we can think ecologically without retreating into fantasy. If the first Avatar movie dramatized first contact with an alien world in 2009, and The Way of Water 2022 explored adaptation under pressure, Fire and Ash confronts moral fracture. What happens when a planetary intelligence can no longer afford innocence, when harmony reveals itself as sustained tension rather than natural state, when the mother must become the warrior? This is Cameron's darkest and most sophisticated entry. A film willing to test the moral premises it has traded on for 15 years, structured less as conventional narrative than as episodic liturgy, alternating between immersion and rapture. It does not reassure. It does not offer clean resolutions. What it offers instead is something increasingly rare in franchise cinema: a sustained attempt to think ecologically, spiritually, and systematically without pretending we can return to prelapsarian, before the fall at the Garden of Eden, simplicity. The question Cameron poses is not whether humanity deserves Pandora, but whether any civilization survives the moment its gods stop being gentle. The technical apparatus: precision over resolution. Technically, Fire and Ash represents culmination rather than breakthrough. Their $400 or $500 million production, including marketing, no longer delivers the shock of Pandora's first appearance. What remains is precision. Veda FX's AI enhanced motion capture allows volcanic ash to behave like weather, fire like breath, performers' micro expressions to survive extreme stylization without flattening into animation. Variable frame rate up to 48 frames per second for action sequences. Smooth aerial combat while preserving depth. It's all here. Cameron's cinematographer, Russell Carpenter, shifts the visual palette decisively. Where Way of Water luxuriated in bioluminescence and aquamarine depths, Fire and Ash trades luminosity for amber glow and sulfur haze. Color temperature becomes moral temperature. Light here is harsher, less forgiving. A visual rhetoric appropriate to a film arguing that spectacle without meaning rots into pornography, and that beauty disciplined by consequence is the only beauty worth creating at this scale. The production involved underwater tanks for volcanic sequences, years-long R&D into real-time ray tracing for ash particle dynamics, and performance capture sessions where actors spent months embodying not just characters but entire cultural systems. The ritualized violence of the Ash people, the contemplative non-violence of the Tulkun whales, the improvisational fury of aerial combat. This is filmmaking as systems engineering, not capturing performances so much as constructing the conditions under which performances can occur within coherent cosmological frameworks. The result justifies Cameron's reputation for technical mastery wedded to narrative purpose. Premium formats, IMAX and 3D, drove 40 to 50% of revenue, suggesting audiences still respond to immersive spectacle, but only when that spectacle serves thematic coherence rather than replacing it. Performances, tragedy, obsolescence, and threshold consciousness. Zoe Saldanha's Neytiri remains the trilogy's emotional engine. but here written closer to tragedy than heroism of previous installments. Her rage is no longer framed as righteous by default. The film refuses to let her maternal fury simplify into noble vengeance, instead tracking how grief calcifies into rigidity, how protective instincts can become obstacles to necessary transformation. Saldana navigates the moral complexity with ferocious precision, embodying a character who must learn that loving fiercely is not the same as seeing clearly. Sam Worthington's Jake Sully, increasingly sidelined, works better as symbol than protagonist, a worldview losing relevance in real time. His tactical thinking, once adequate, now proves insufficient for conflicts that cannot be resolved to strategy or force. The film's most honest moments involve Jake recognizing his own obsolescence without the script pretending this recognition resolves anything. The standout performance belongs to Sigourney Weaver's Carrie, who becomes the site where the film's metaphysics concentrate. No longer merely strangers, spiritually gifted, Carrie functions as threshold between human and Na'vi, nurture and rat, coherence and collapse. Her connection to Awa is not sentimentalized, it is invasive, destabilizing, costly. Cameron resists the savior figure template, instead presenting Kiri as someone whose permeability to planetary consciousness nearly destroys her. Weaver, performing through motion capture as a teenager, delivers the trilogy's most sophisticated portrayal of what communion with something genuinely other might demand. Una Chaplin's Warang, leader of the Ash People, represents the film's most provocative creation and its most underutilized. Deliberately underwritten, she functions less as character than vector, a personification of what happens when trauma becomes theology, when scarcity produces cultures that sanctify violence as survival strategy. She's terrifying, charismatic, and represents the shadow side of every spiritual tradition. What happens when one seeks transcendence through control rather than surrender? The film glimpses depths here it does not fully explore, suggesting either future development or a missed opportunity to examine the shadow side of spirituality more rigorously. The Ash People and the end of ecological innocence. See, I told you it's imperfect. Oh my gosh. I had to drink, had to take a drink in between. It's messy. What can I say? The introduction of the Ash People fractures Pandora's moral unity, as my coughing just now did. You would think that I'd be able to have a sip of whatever without coughing. Where earlier films opposed industrial extraction to ecological harmony as binary opposites, Fire and Ash splinters the Na'vi themselves along lines of resource access, historical trauma, and divergent cosmological interpretation. The Ash People inhabit volcanic wastelands shaped by devastation into a culture that has weaponized suffering into identity. Let me read that again. The Ash People inhabit volcanic wastelands shaped by devastation into a culture that has weaponized suffering into identity. Their shamanic practices, fire rituals suffused with pain and dominance, represent what might be called negative transcendence, ecstasy achieved through cruelty rather than surrender, power pursued without genuine relinquishment of ego. This is spirituality as trauma response. Religion hardened into justification for violence. Cameron's crucial insight here is that scarcity produces culture, and culture can sanctify harm as easily as it sanctifies care. Ecological thinking that remains romantic, that imagines harmony emerging naturally, once domination is removed, cannot account for situations where resources genuinely constrain, where histories genuinely wound, where competing cosmologies genuinely conflict without one or the other being simply correct. The film's portrayal of the Ash people risks Orientalist coding. The volcanic fire clan as a dangerous other in contrast to oceanic water clan nobility. But Cameron partially subverts this by refusing simple villainy. Warang's people are not evil, they are what trauma plus theology produces when healing proves impossible. Their rage is comprehensible, even as their methods remain condemnable. This moral complexity, acknowledging legitimacy without endorsing violence, represents a significant maturation from earlier entries. Ava herself undergoes corresponding transformation. No longer merely nurturing mother, she reveals a warrior aspect. The Tolkien whales, her Buddha-like representatives of Ava, that is, begin in strict pacifism, convinced that violence only begets violence. Only when their abstention becomes complicity in genocide do they marshal their mass against human ships. The film treats this shift not as triumphant, but as tragic necessity. Violence entered with full awareness of its spiritual cost, never celebrated. This is Cameron's most sophisticated moral argument, that balance is not peace, but sustained tension. That intervention always leaves residue, that planetary intelligence, if real, would be indifferent to individual suffering in service of systemic continuity. Ecology without innocence. Spirituality without sentiment is what all of this is. The deleted dream hunt and entheogenic subtext. There's a deleted dream hunt sequence in the original Avatar movie. You could see it in the DVD extended versions or whatever they're called, wherein Jake ingests psychoactive substances and endures ego death visions before claiming Toruk Makto as spirit ally. This haunts the trilogy's spiritual ambitions. That deleted scene would have made explicit what the films now only suggest, that true transformation requires surrender beyond what narrative cinema typically portrays, that communion with genuine otherness demands relinquishment of the separate self. Fire and Ash recuperates this entheogenic logic through Kiri's arc. Her seizures at Ava's nods, her invasive connection to planetary consciousness, and especially her ritual fusing spider with Pandora flora, enact what the dream hunt would have shown. The ego must be willing to be rewritten by a larger intelligence, or else it translates everything into more of itself. A spider's transformation, breathing Pandora, growing a neural cue, visualizes positive metamorphosis, a self that expands into hybrid being, relinquishing purity for genuine participation. Contrast this with Warang's fire rituals, which represent the opposite path. Pseudo-transcendence through dominance, counterfeit union that reinforces rather than dissolves ego boundaries. The film is careful enough to show that this isn't absence of soul, because Warang is not soulless, but she's a soul in a brutalized configuration, what adept psychologists would call an underworld style of spirituality, where eros, aggression, and ritual pain tangle into a kind of negative sacrament. There's a long history of mystical and erotic practices that uses piercing, cutting, pain, or bondage to reach altered states. A tradition that post-structuralist readers of, say, Marquis de Sade and of psychoanalytic writers have tracked as both revealing and dangerously close to outright violence. Warang sits exactly on that knife's edge. Ecstasy through sadism, ritualized cruelty, fire as sacrament. Archetypal psychology would say that this is soul in its underworld register, not the absence of psyche, but its descent into what depth psychologists sometimes call the pathologizing function of the soul, where the gods show up as symptoms, compulsions, and perversions, rather than as overt religious forms. Warang's fire rituals belong to the same family as sadomasochistic spiritual practices in certain ascetic and erotic tradition. Cutting, piercing, and pain used to trigger altered states that can feel like union, yet remain organized around the separate self's drama. The notion of negative merging from psychoanalysis named this phenomenon precisely. Two or more beings straining for fusion while clinging to separateness. And the Ash people enact that on a tribal scale. They want Awa's power without relinquishing their identity as the most wounded, and so they circle endlessly around their own injury. This set of states can be characterized under an umbrella term of negative samadhi. It mimics transcendence. There is intensity, there is high, but it traps its practitioners in a loop of ego, confirming itself through domination and exploitation, regressive competition, and destruction of interconnection through the severing of vital links, especially those links that represent disloyalty to an underlying ideology of grievance and original wounding. The founding mythological acts performed by every tribal primitivism and fetishizing schema of exclusionary participation. Every pathological and destructive schism of us versus them polarization. It's formulaic. The film's shamanic subtext operates as counterpoint to Cameron's public statements about AI. In multiple 2025 interviews still in this year, which is almost over, Cameron describes generative AI replacing actors as horrifying. The opposite of his performance capture philosophy, which he calls the purest form of celebrating human performers. He emphasized that Fire and Ash contains no generative AI. The emotional depth comes from real actors like Saldana spending months underwater, Weaver channeling adolescent spirituality, Chaplin embodying volcanic fury. What complicates all of this is that Cameron has become one of the most articulate skeptics of generative AI in cinema, even as his films are often mistaken for AI showcases. He has gone out of his way to stress that no generative AI created performances in Fire and Ash, that the emotional weight rests on bodies and faces, Saldana's underwater work, Weaver's adolescent Kiri, Chaplin's volcanic Warang, captured and translated, not synthesized. In that light, performance capture itself starts to look like a positive shamanism. Actors willingly entering altered states and being technologically extended, but still present as subjects who can answer for what they invoke. The horror scenario he sketches, cheap, prompt driven actors trained on scrapped likenesses, parallels the film's own critique of dark shamanism. Spectacle detached from soul, intensity generated without anyone truly at risk in the space of a cinematic experience, yet which stakes everything this cinematic experience when considered in the larger, holistically defined, ecological planetary scale crisis we face ourselves. Its performance hunts life enhancing dynamism, vitality in the service of destructive ends through even more destructive means. Fire and Ash insist that meaning requires incarnation. Without an actual someone on the other side of the ritual or the rig, all you are left with is very expensive, very empty trances. Either the trances of mass technology or of tribal sadomasochism. This insistence on embodied performance connects to the film's deeper argument that meaning emerges from genuine encounter with material constraints, not from algorithmic averaging. Just as Spider must physically transform to breathe Pandora rather than simulating participation through technology, so must cinema emerge from actual human labor rather than prompt engineering simulation, even when the latter can be helpful in various phases of production conceptualization and design. The critique of AI as replacement, however, parallels the critique of extraction capitalism. Both treat consciousness as resource to be optimized rather than mystery to be honored, participated in by being delved into and explored to its outer reaches. Planetary Mother and Suppressed Feminine Divine. At the conceptual center of Fire and Ash lies Ava as restoration of planetary consciousness figured as mother. I deem it as a recovery of what, say, the Essene Christianity once balanced with Heavenly Father before patriarchal revision edited the earthly mother from liturgy. There are some scholars who believe that Jesus was an Essene. Usually those are liberal scholars, but that's for another time, perhaps. and another podcast. Coincidentally, and as an important but relevant aside, here's how a prayer to a Divine Mother might have sounded like if you were in a scene reciting one. O Divine Mother, Shekinah glory, the indwelling glory, river of life, flowing from the Father's throne. You who danced in the void before creation, who birthed the stars from your womb of endless night, embrace this prayer as the child returns to the hearth. You are the nurturing earth that receives the seed and multiplies it 100-fold. The healing balm that soothes the wounds of betrayal, the wisdom wailed in parable that fools dismiss but seers adore. Pour forth your waters of mercy upon the fractured vessel of our world, mending that tikkun olam where hearts have shattered under the weight of misunderstanding and betrayal. Let your grace dissolve the agitation that agitates the soul, the refusal that refuses the light, the games that mock the sacred bond of wisdom, for you are the mother of compassion, the co-creator who whispers it is good over every broken thing, and no poison can withstand your embrace. You are the wisdom that builds a path where there is no path, a way where there is no way. May this audio prayer, rising like incense from the heart's mosque, wash away the veils of prejudice and pride, healing the split where love and fear collide. Where Western religion elevated transcendent spirit over immanent matter, masculine law over feminine relationship, Ava reverses that hierarchy without simply inverting it. This is not sentimentalized ecofeminism. The film's warrior mother is fierce, interventionist, willing to drown enemies and summon Tulkun to battle when systemic balance demands it, but only when there is no other recourse available and all other options have been exhausted. Planetary intelligence, Cameron suggests, would not be gentle. It would be relentless in service of continuation, indifferent to individual suffering when the web of life itself faces rapture. The contemporary resonance is impossible to ignore or dismiss. As Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth's December 2025 chaplain reforms put out, eliminate materials promoting New Age notions or secular humanism in favor of traditional religious ministry in the military. As all of this is happening, Avatar stages precisely the cosmology such reforms reject. Relational power over hierarchical authority, plural spiritual technologies over singular orthodoxy, integration over exclusion. Hegseth might have good intentions, but his reforms represent legitimate concerns about military cohesion under fire. The direction toward narrow traditionalism rather than expanded pluralism enacts precisely the regressive move Cameron's film diagnosed as pulling consciousness down the developmental spiral rather than ascending it toward integration. Within that contextualization, it should be noted that the bound arrows Turuk Makto holds at a pivotal moment in our cinematic story are not fascist domination, but voluntary alliance against existential threat. Democratic Mobilization, not authoritarian command, is what they represent. But naturally, fallacies of eco-fascism will surface, but they must be averted in any type of real-world scenario. And for that reason alone, this facet of the film is worth discussing and thinking about. Whether Cameron consciously intended this political resonance is less important than recognizing that mythic cinema inevitably intersects with civilizational choices. The film does not resolve these tensions. How could it? But stages them with unusual sophistication for a franchise blockbuster. Box office as symptom. What the numbers reveal. Fire and Ash opened to 345, between 345 and 347 million globally, 89 million domestically, securing the number one spot despite competition from Zootopia 2 sequel. Post-Christmas momentum pushed it to 760.4 million by current numbers. That's as of December 28th and 29th. Approaching 800 million plus by New Year's Day. Strong, but not unprecedented. Analysts project 1.5 to 2 billion globally, potentially matching The Way of Water, but unlikely to reach the original's 2.9 billion. The critical audience gap, the divide between critics and the response of the audience. Critics are hovering between 66 and 68% all over the place. Audiences are in the low 90s, currently at 91 and 92 in places like Rotten Tomatoes and elsewhere. And I'm being exact because such precise numerology matters for those of us who are a little bit on the superstitious side. But this gap is the widest in franchise history. This split reveals developmental tensions. Critics see repetition and formula. Audiences embrace immersion and emotional resonance. Sentiment says one thing, ticket spending another. The divide maps into deeper questions about whether spectacle cinema can still carry philosophical weight, or has it collapsed into pure sensation? My own review here attempts to bridge that great divide, and I will let the audience decide how or whether or not it succeeds in that endeavor, however messily or imperfectly. International performance is also crucial here as a gauge. China delivered 57.6 million opening weekend, second biggest 2025 opening after Zootopia 2. Premium formats drove 40 to 50% of the revenue, confirming that audiences still respond to theatrical immersion, but only when spectacle serves meaning rather than replacing it. Disney's $6 billion global 2025 box office, first post-pandemic, validates Bob Iger's strategy. Invest in tentpole franchises that deliver both commercial returns and cultural conversation. The success of Fire and Ash and Zootopia 2, heading towards 1.5 billion now, demonstrates that family-friendly spectacle still dominates when executed with craft and thematic coherence. Yet the diminishing returns are unmistakable. The original Avatar was a cultural earthquake. A Way of Water proved franchise viability. Fire and Ash feels like consolidation, rather than expansion. Technically masterful, thematically deepened, but no longer capable of surprise. The question facing Avatar 4 and 5, scheduled to be released in 2029 and 2031 respectively, is whether further refinement justifies the massive investment, or whether the moment for planetary myths via CGI spectacle has passed. Maybe, maybe not. Cosmos, Psyche, and the Avatar Decade, archetypal resonance and civilizational crisis. The film also feels uncannily tuned to the kind of archetypal weather described in a work called Cosmos and Psyche, wherein outer crises in these work are described as echoes of inner planetary and astrological configurations at large, as microcosmic events unfolding together with macrocosmic processes in the sky. Not as fate, but as transpersonal patterns and dynamics for us to grok in history and culture, foreshadowing configurations and events in the future. For instance, Fire and Ash plays like a Saturn-Pluto decade movie. Contraction, reckoning, and forced structural change, dramatized through a planetary mother who can no longer afford to be purely gentle. Kiri's permeability to Awa, oscillating between mystical union and near psychotic fragmentation, reads Neptunian in the richest sense. The solution that can become revelation or breakdown depending on how much ego is willing to die. The Ash people, with their traumatized will to power and sacralized violence, carry a Mars-Pluto signature. Survival drive turned theological, intensely pursued for its own sake until it curdles into destruction. None of this turns the movie into an astrological allegory. It simply situates Cameron's myth inside the same archetypal field that is producing our own climate shocks, institutional meltdowns, and spiritual realignments off screens and behind the scenes. Viewed through the lens of cultural astrology and archetypal patterns, Avatar Fire and Ash arrives at a threshold moment. What might be understood as a Uranus-Pluto intensification period following their 2012 to 2015 square, now entering a new phase as consciousness collectively confronts limits of extraction-based civilization. That is a mouthful, as a lot of these sentences are. The film's thematic content, the ecological crisis, a conflict between growth and sustainability, confrontation with shadow aspect of spirituality, the necessity of death and rebirth, transformation of this latest iteration of our ongoing planetary initiation, resonates with archetypal patterns associated with Saturn-Pluto cycles, the pressure of time, the weight of history, demand for structural transformation that can no longer be postponed. Kiri's arc particularly embodies Neptunian dissolution and reconstitution. the permeability to collective consciousness that threatens individual coherence, the necessity of navigating between mystical union and psychotic fragmentation, the burden of serving as threshold between worlds. Her seizures and near-death experiences literalize what spiritual traditions describe as dark nights of the soul, initiations that cannot be refused but might be fatal. The Ash people represent martial Plutonian energies turned distractive. Will to power divorced from wisdom, survival drive calcified into theology of domination. Trauma weaponized into cosmology. Their fire rituals enact what happens when intensity is pursued as end rather than means, when ecstasy becomes addiction rather than transformation. Orang's volcanic rites make clear that this theology is not without soul, but saturated with primitive and sadomasochistic soul states, or negative merging and negative samadhi, as transpersonal psychology and mystical studies might have put it. We briefly touched upon this earlier in this offering review. In archetypal terms, or archetypal terms, this is soul in its pathological mode, disfiguring eros, fusing it with aggression, ritualizing that which might be called dark devotion into a counterfeit transcendence. Contemporary depth psychology writers have traced how eroticized suffering can edge into mystical language, but Fire and Ash keeps that edge visible. The Ash people's negative samadhi is regressive and dangerous precisely because it lives so close to violence, blurring the line between authentic surrender and a compulsive return to the woundedness. In transpersonal psychological terms, all these may be characterized by their Scorpio-saturated dynamics of the Martian Plutonian kind. Cameron's insistence on embodied performance over AI generation resonates with broader cultural anxieties about disembodiment and simulation here, a quintessentially Neptunian crisis of distinguishing authentic from artificial, genuine encounter from algorithmic approximation. His horror at AI replacing actors reflects deeper intuition that consciousness cannot be optimized away, that meaning requires friction with material constraint. The timing of the film's release, post-pandemic, amid climate acceleration, during renewed culture wars over spiritual pluralism versus religious traditionalism, suggests it arrives not as escapism, but as diagnostic ritual, a collective working through of civilizational choices we can no longer avoid. The working through here then must be at once cosmic and psychic, collective and personal. Both. Here's the critique of what remains insufficient. Fire and Ash is not without significant limitation. No, it's not. Its antagonistic forces occasionally drift toward abstraction. The RDA remains faceless corporate evil rather than inhabited by characters wrestling with genuine moral complexity. Spider's transformation, while thematically crucial, feels rushed in execution. Orang's arc as dark, erotic Sahik deserves far more development than the film allows. Cameron's dialogue remains functional rather than lyrical. Serviceable exposition that rarely achieves the poetic density the film's themes deserve. The episodic structure, while intentional, produces pacing that will frustrate audiences expecting conventional escalation. Most significantly, the film's gestures toward alternatives to extraction, capitalism without. Let me reread this. Most significantly, the film gestures toward alternatives to extraction capitalism without fully imagining them. The Na'vi live in a gift economy, but how this functions at scale, how it could inform actual human civilization, remains unexplored. The film stages the problem without articulating systemic solutions beyond violent resistance and divine intervention. But perhaps that is all a film can do given the context and the scale of the problem. The gender dynamics, while improved from earlier entries, still center male protagonists. Neytiri's tragedy orbits Jake's obsolescence. Kiri's power serves narrative function more than exploring female shamanic authority on its own terms. Warang's potential as complex female antagonist is sacrificed to Quaritch's redemption arc. The franchise's relationship to indigenous people remains fraught. Cameron consults cultural advisors and incorporates authentic elements, but the fundamental structure, white filmmaker creating fantasy indigeneity for mass consumption, real indigenous activists facing militarized violence defending actual lands, while audiences enjoy simulated resistance in theatrical safety. All that carries colonial echoes and baggage the film cannot fully escape. These are not failures of ambition, but limitations inherent in attempting to work at this scale within commercial constraints. The miracle is how much Cameron achieves despite these structural limitations, not that he transcends them entirely. Let's do a sort of a conclusion. This is section 10 in my review called Myth Under Stress. Avatar, Fire and Ash is not a crowd pleaser in conventional terms. It is myth under stress, spectacle willing to implicate itself, franchise cinema that dares to darken its own cosmology rather than reassuring audiences with false solutions. It does not pretend innocence can be recovered. It does not offer redemption without cost. What it provides instead is increasingly rare in contemporary cinema. A sustained attempt to think ecologically, spiritually, and politically without pretending harmony emerges naturally or that intervention leaves no residue. Cameron's project across 3 films has been to construct a cosmology dense enough to support moral complexity. A planetary intelligence neither sentimental nor vengeful, culture shaped by history and constraint rather than simple virtue or vice, protagonists who must learn obsolescence is not failure, but necessity when circumstances evolve beyond their frameworks. Whether this project ultimately matters depends on questions the film cannot answer. Can franchise cinema still carry philosophical weight? Can spectacle discipline itself through meaning? Can spectacle discipline itself through meaning? Can mass market myth teach civilizations facing collapse anything they cannot learn themselves elsewhere? The evidence suggests guarded optimism. The critical audience split indicates the film reaches viewers whom traditional philosophical discourse cannot reach, offering experiential knowledge of interconnection, visceral understanding of consequence, imaginative rehearsal of moral dilemmas before they become literal. This is cinema at its best. This is not salvation. Although it is preparation of mass consciousness for mass transformation, perhaps, hopefully, the film does not save us from civilizational crises, but helps us imagine what surviving such crises might demand. Capacity to grieve, willingness to transform, courage to act with incomplete knowledge, wisdom to recognize when old solutions worsen new problems. Cameron is not asking whether humanity deserves Pandora. He is asking whether any civilization survives the moment its gods stop being gentle. When planetary intelligence demands change rather than comfort. When survival requires shedding illusions rather than clinging to them. When the mother reveals herself as warrior, because care without boundaries is not care but enabling. Fire and Ash suggests the answer depends on whether we can metabolize grief, integrate shadow, and act from connection rather than separation. Not as abstract ideals, but as practical necessities for continuation of life. The film will not change the world. No film ever did, not at first. But it might change how some viewers imagine change is possible. In an age of algorithmically optimized sensation and ideologically flattened discourse, even that modest achievement deserves recognition. That's why I'm doing this review. If stars and grades and rewards were involved, I might have given it 3.5 stars. I was never bored. Yes, it was a flawed, overstuffed, occasionally ponderous film that nevertheless represents something increasingly rare. Earnest attempt to use commercial cinema's most expensive tools in service of genuine questions rather than predetermined answers. Whether you accept its cosmology or not, you cannot deny the sincerity and craft with which Cameron presents it. In an era of cynical franchises, that alone commands respect. That means that the fire is necessary. The ash is what we make of it. Whether we can tell the difference in time, that remains an open question. And perhaps the most honest question this type of innovative cinema can ask. Oh, let me give you a theoretical addendum for what it's worth. Hybridity, tribal gravity, and the failure of integration. Let's give it a pregnant pause for a moment. See, but Fire and Ash What Fire and Ash ultimately exposes more clearly than any previous installment is that the central conflict is no longer between nature and extraction or even between colonizer and indigenous world. It is between integration and tribal gravity, between systems capable of metabolizing hybridity and systems that respond to complexity by hardening identity. Both Varang and Quaritch occupy this fault line. They are not opposites, they are mirrors. Each represents a form of divine individuality without integration. Agency unmoored from relational wholeness, power asserted without participation in a larger order. Both are hybrid beings who deny hybridity. Quaritch is literally a human consciousness inhabiting a Na'vi body, yet clings to marine identity as fetishized anchor. Varang leads a people shaped by ecological devastation, yet sacralizes the wound itself, transforming trauma into theological destiny. Each demands purity in a world that has already become mixed. This is not merely moral failure, it is a developmental one. Integral psychology names this error the pre-trans fallacy, the confusion of pre-rational fusion, participation mystique, and naive, abased, and diminished consciousness with translational, transrational integration. Tribal cohesion, when mistaken for spiritual unity, produces exactly the kind of violent certainty that Ash people embody. Their rituals look shamanic but function psychologically as ego fortification rather than ego dissolution. What appears as transcendence is, in fact, regression stabilized by intensity. Here, the film becomes unexpectedly precise. The Ash people are not evil Na'vi, they are a pathological network organized around an obligatory passage point around the wound. Participation in the group requires continual reaffirmation of grievance. Fire, pain, and ritualized cruelty are not symbols but actants, material forces that shape affect, loyalty, and perception. The volcanic environment itself is part of the assemblage. Scarcity is not metaphorical, it is infrastructural. Actor network theory helps explain why such groups coagulate so powerfully. Once an assemblage stabilizes around a fetishized center, whether trauma, ideology, race, nation, or purity, it resists transformation because transformation would dissolve the very associations that produce belonging. The group survives by reenacting its origin wound. Healing becomes betrayal. This is why hybridity and interdependence is experienced as contamination rather than possibility. By contrast, Kiri represents something categorically different. Integration without fetish, permeability without collapse. Her relationship to Ava is not tribal, not ideological, not even strictly religious. It is participatory. She does not control the planetary intelligence, nor does she dissolve into it. She functions as what a pragmatist philosopher might have called the figure of thirdness, mediating, translating, holding tension without resolving it prematurely.
This distinction matters because it clarifies a confusion common in contemporary culture that relationality itself is inherently ethical. The film insists otherwise. Connection can be pathological and disfigured. Organic societies can become totalitarian. The goddess can devour as easily as she can nourish. Dyads, mother and child, leader and tribe, can calcify into closed loops that exclude thirdness. New and better symbolization, meditation, differentiation, all the third options. Elsewhere, there are thinkers that insist that the divine individual is always masculine and that the feminine dyadic couple touches a real structure but only at a partial level. What Fire and Ash demonstrates is that both masculine and feminine archetypes have higher and lower expressions. Rang's negative feminine is not relational abundance but fused identity. Quaritch negative masculine is not sovereign agency but instrumental domination. Both fail at the same point. They cannot tolerate liminality. They cannot be anything in between. They cannot be hybrid. This is why the film's true antagonist is not a character but a mode of organization. What a psychoanalyst, someone like Wilfred Bion, would recognize as a fight-flight group masquerading as destiny. Identity is preserved by perpetual threat. Authority is sustained by the promise of protection. Meaning is reduced to loyalty. Against this, Cameron stages a quieter, more difficult proposition that survival in a planetary crisis requires networks capable of transformation, not tribes demanding purity or more firepower for that matter. Systems that can incorporate difference without dissolving, individuals who can act without fetishizing their role, spirituality that does not confuse intensity or perceived domination with truth. Seen this way, Fire and Ash is less a myth of ecological salvation than a diagnostic of civilizational stress. It asks why societies, when confronted with complexity and loss, so often retreat into sacred violence rather than undertake the slower, riskier work of integration. Why wounded identities so readily become moral absolutes? Why gods, once deprived of innocence, are so easily weaponized? The film offers no reassurance that this process will succeed. It only suggests that without thirdness, without mediating structures capable of holding hybridity and the tension of opposites, every civilization, no matter how spiritually attuned, eventually turns its wounds into weapons. Pandora is not our fantasy future. It is our present rendered visible. Put differently, Avatar functions as diagnostic of multiple simultaneous crises: developmental, pre-trans confusion in integral terms, ecological, extraction exhaustion in ecological terms, technological AI threat to embodiment, and political, tribalism versus integration. This isn't just film criticism anymore, it's cultural diagnosis using cinema as primary symptom text. To that extent, this has worked as a study of how civilizations fail when hybridity outpaces their symbolic capacity to digest or integrate the material. Holistically speaking, Fire and Ash embodies spiral dynamic progression. Red-blue conflicts, tribal wars, yield to orange spectacle, tech innovation. Green empathy, family bonds, and turquoise unity, Ava maternal consciousness, emerge only after thresholds are crossed. Its influence, the influence of Avatar Fire and Ash and the rest of the Avatar franchise, raises awareness on an ecological scales. It perhaps allows us to imagine what an evolutionary leap that humanity must take might look like. Something that reaches beyond the screens, potentially inspiring societal shifts in a divided world. For sequels, Avatar 4 in 2029 and Avatar 5 in 2031, Cameron hints at cost efficiencies to sustain the saga despite uncertainties. Uncertainties remain.